It was a crisp autumn morning when Jonathan Hartley decided he would fake his death. For months, a nagging suspicion had burrowed its way into his mind, a dark, consuming thought that the people he trusted most were not who they claimed to be. His once loyal business partner, Mark, had started evading his calls, and whispers of mismanaged funds had reached his ears. Friends who once gathered around his dining table had become distant. Even Emily, his wife, seemed oddly preoccupied, her phone always within her grip. It wasn't mistrust born of paranoia. Jonathan had spent years building a life many would envy. A successful logistics company, a beautiful home in the suburbs, a loving wife, and 2 young children, Amelia and Ben, who were the very center of his world. But lately, it all felt fragile, as if the threads holding his life together were fraying behind his back. The decision to disappear was not one he made lightly. Jonathan had always been pragmatic, a man of logic. He planned every detail meticulously, knowing the risks. It started with the rented cabin 2 states over, tucked away in the woods where no one would find him. He transferred a modest amount of money to a secret account, enough to sustain him for a while, but not enough to raise suspicion. The hardest part was crafting the accident, a boating mishap, the perfect scenario for someone who wanted to vanish without a trace. On the morning of his death, Jonathan kissed Emily goodbye as usual, his heart heavy with guilt. Amelia and Ben were still asleep, their small faces peaceful. He lingered at their bedroom doors longer than he should have, memorizing every detail. It wasn't forever, he told himself. This was for them. The lake was quiet when he arrived, the kind of quiet that carried an eerie finality. He left his wallet and keys on the boat and ensured his shoes were left behind, evidence of a man who had fallen into the water and never surfaced. Then he swam to the shore and melted into the forest, his soaked clothes clinging to him as he disappeared from the life he had known. The news broke within hours. Local businessman presumed dead in tragic boating accident. Emily's devastated cries over the phone when the authorities called pierced his heart. He sat in the tiny cabin, staring at the cracked screen of an old television, watching his life unravel from a distance. He hadn't anticipated how deeply her grief would cut him. Days turned into weeks, and Jonathan watched from the shadows. Mark, his partner, had already begun whispering about restructuring the company. Friends and colleagues sent flowers and condolences, but he noticed how quickly they faded from Emily's side. The same people who had toasted to his success at countless parties seemed almost relieved to move on. But it was Emily's struggle that shook him most. She had always been strong, the backbone of their family, but now she seemed lost. Bills began to pile up as the life insurance claim was delayed. She sold his car and started working late shifts at a diner just to keep the house afloat. At first, he told himself this was necessary, a trial to separate the loyal from the deceitful. But the longer he stayed away, the more the guilt gnawed at him. Was he testing them, or was he punishing them? The tipping point came when he saw Amelia crying on the front porch one evening, clutching a toy he had given her. It had been a gift for her birthday, a memory she now held on to as if it were all she had left of him. Jonathan wanted to run to her, to scoop her into his arms and promise her that everything would be okay. But he didn't. Instead, he waited, his chest heavy with the weight of his choices. It wasn't until the arrival of a strange car that everything changed. Jonathan watched as a man he didn't recognize stepped onto his porch. He was tall, well-dressed, and carried himself with a confidence that set Jonathan's nerves on edge. Emily opened the door, her face a mix of surprise and hesitation. The man stepped inside, and the door closed behind them. Jonathan's fists clenched. Who was this man? And why was he here? The sight of the stranger stepping into his home felt like a blow to Jonathan's gut. He stayed hidden in the shadows of the wooded area across the street, his eyes locked on the warmly lit windows of his own house. The man inside moved with an air of familiarity, his gestures confident as he spoke to Emily. Jonathan couldn't make out the words, but he didn't need to. Her guarded expression told him enough. For hours, he lingered there, cold and stiff, as the man stayed. He didn't leave until well past midnight. When the door finally opened, Jonathan's chest tightened as he watched Emily see him off. Her arms were crossed, her face unreadable. But when the man leaned in and kissed her cheek, something inside Jonathan snapped. The next day, Jonathan followed Emily. He'd always known she was strong, but watching her work long hours at the diner and then rush home to care for the children made his guilt almost unbearable. Amelia and Ben seemed quieter, their laughter a rare occurrence now. But it was Emily's meeting with the stranger at a small cafe later that evening that made Jonathan's blood boil. They sat close, their conversation appearing intense. At one point, the man reached out and touched Emily's hand. She didn't pull away. Jonathan's nails dug into his palms as he fought the urge to storm in and demand answers. Who was this man? A friend? A confidant? Or something more? The question plagued him as he retreated to his cabin that night. His thoughts spiraled as he replayed every interaction he'd witnessed. His suspicions grew darker, more consuming. The following week brought more revelations. Mark, his business partner, was making moves that Jonathan hadn't anticipated. The company, once a thriving enterprise, was teetering on the edge of collapse under Mark's leadership. Jonathan couldn't figure out if it was incompetence or intentional sabotage, but the realization that Mark had been funneling money into a personal account left little doubt. Jonathan's anger burned hotter with each passing day. He had thought his death would reveal the truth, but now it felt like it was tearing his family apart and destroying the legacy he had worked so hard to build. Then came the ultimate betrayal. Jonathan returned to the house one evening, careful to stay out of sight, only to see the stranger sitting at his dining table. Emily was there, along with Amelia and Ben. The man laughed with them, even helping Ben with his homework. Jonathan watched in disbelief as Emily smiled, an exhausted, fragile smile, but a smile nonetheless. The man was filling the void Jonathan had left behind. For the first time since his disappearance, Jonathan questioned his motives. He had thought he was testing the loyalty of those around him, but what if he had pushed them to a breaking point? Emily was trying to survive, to keep the family afloat, and yet a deep, primal part of him couldn't accept the stranger in his place. Jonathan's resolve cracked. He couldn't stay silent any longer. That night, he made a decision. If he was going to reclaim his life, he needed to do it now. He would confront the stranger, face Emily, and demand answers. But he also knew he couldn't do it impulsively. He needed proof. Proof of Mark's betrayal, proof of the stranger's intentions, and proof that his death had served a purpose beyond causing pain. Over the next few days, Jonathan began his investigation in earnest. He hacked into the company's servers from a stolen laptop, piecing together a trail of emails and transactions that exposed Mark's deceit. He followed the stranger, discovering more about the man who had stepped into his family's life. His name was Anthony Cole, a lawyer and an old college friend of Emily's. What unsettled Jonathan most wasn't Anthony's presence. It was the kindness he showed to his family. He wasn't a predator or a manipulator. If anything, Anthony seemed like a lifeline. The realization left Jonathan at a crossroads. How could he reclaim his life without destroying the fragile stability Emily had built in his absence? How could he face his family knowing the pain he had caused them? Jonathan stood outside his house that night, his hand trembling as he reached for the door. For months he had watched from the shadows, but now the moment of truth had come. Would they forgive him? Or would his betrayal cut deeper than theirs? Jonathan stood outside the door, his heart hammering in his chest. His hand hovered over the doorknob, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He had spent months orchestrating this test, convinced he was doing the right thing. But now, faced with the reality of his actions, he felt paralyzed. Taking a deep breath, he turned the knob and stepped inside. The living room was warm and alive with laughter. Emily sat on the couch, her head thrown back in a rare moment of levity as Anthony read aloud from a children's book to Amelia and Ben. It was a picture-perfect scene, one that twisted the knife of guilt deeper into Jonathan's chest. All at once, the room fell silent. Emily's laughter died as her eyes locked onto Jonathan. For a moment she simply stared, her face a mixture of disbelief and shock. Amelia and Ben froze, their small faces turning toward the man they believed was gone forever. "Dad?" Ben whispered, his voice trembling. Jonathan's throat tightened. He nodded, tears already forming in his eyes. "It's me, buddy." Amelia let out a cry and bolted into his arms. Jonathan knelt, holding her tightly as Ben joined them, clinging to him as though he might disappear again. Over their heads, his eyes met Emily's, and what he saw there made his heart ache. Anger, confusion, and a pain so deep it was almost unbearable. "How could you?" she whispered, her voice trembling with barely restrained fury. Jonathan stood, his children still clinging to him, and tried to explain. "I thought I was doing it for you, for all of you. I needed to know the truth about the people I trusted, about Mark, about—" "About me?" Emily interrupted, her voice sharp and cold. Jonathan faltered. "I never doubted you, Emily, but I needed to see how the world would treat you without me." Emily's expression hardened. "And what did you find out, Jonathan?" "That I struggled. That I had to work myself to exhaustion to keep a roof over our kids' heads, that I had to accept help from the people who cared, while you played ghost." "I didn't mean to hurt you," he said, his voice breaking. "But you did," she replied, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You hurt all of us." Anthony cleared his throat and stood, his gaze level but calm. "I think I should go." He turned to Emily and placed a hand on her shoulder. "If you need anything, call me." Jonathan bristled but said nothing as Anthony left. The silence he left behind was suffocating. "Who is he?" Jonathan finally asked, his voice low. "Someone who helped when you weren't here," Emily snapped. "Someone who stepped in when I didn't know how I was going to make it another day." Jonathan's guilt deepened. He had thought his absence would expose betrayal, but all it had done was leave his family vulnerable. "Emily, I'm sorry. I made a terrible mistake," he said. "I thought I was protecting you, but all I did was hurt you. I want to fix this. I want to come back." Emily crossed her arms, her gaze unwavering. "It's not that simple, Jonathan. You don't get to just walk back into our lives after what you've done. The kids might forgive you, but I don't know if I can. Not yet." Her words hit him like a blow, but he knew she was right. "I'll earn it," he said quietly. "Whatever it takes, I'll prove to you that I'm here for good. No more lies." Emily's face softened slightly, though the pain remained. "Then you'd better start with the truth. Why did you really do it?" Jonathan hesitated, but then told her everything. The suspicions about Mark, the need to see who would stand by their family, the doubts that had consumed him. He didn't sugarcoat it or make excuses, laying bare his guilt and regret. When he finished, Emily sighed, exhaustion etched into every line of her face. "I don't know if I'll ever fully understand why you did this, Jonathan, But the kids need their father, and I need time. He nodded. I'll give you all the time you need. Just let me be here for you and the kids. Over the following weeks, Jonathan began the painstaking process of rebuilding his life. He confronted Mark, exposing his fraud and reclaiming the company. He devoted himself to his children, making up for the months he had missed. And he gave Emily space, never pushing, always supporting. One evening, months later, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Emily turned to him. "I still don't know if I can forgive you," she said softly, "but I can see you're trying. That means something." Jonathan nodded, his heart heavy but hopeful. "I'll never stop trying." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Jonathan realized that redemption wasn't about a single moment of forgiveness. It was about showing, day after day, that he was the man they deserved, and he would spend the rest of his life proving it.